My name is Andy Canterna, and I am the National Account Manager for all schools for the deaf and blind across the country here at American Reading Company. It is a title that I'm very honored to have. American Reading Company creates structured literacy solutions to service all kids and have them reading on or above grade level. And about 3 years ago, we worked with just 2 schools for the deaf in the US. Today, we have 15 and growing, with many more potentially looking to on board. And in that time, we have worked really hard to work with our students who are deaf and hard of hearing in ways to access materials in a differentiated way to meet their needs. It is a passion project that started a few years ago when I met with the wonderful folks in Delaware at the School for the Deaf in Newark, who reached out simply asking if we could help close some of the reading gaps that they were experiencing. And not knowing exactly how, but realizing I faced the exact same issues in Baltimore City Public Schools, where I taught and led buildings for many years, we were able to put an initial plan in place. And fast forward to today, we've been fortunate enough to partner with some of the best minds in deaf education. And whether it is to address foundational skills that don't apply to all, or simple additions like adding conceptually incorrect sign to our cold reads, we are always looking for ways to partner with our schools and make improvements. So I am really excited for today. We have years of experience at the table and some of the most respected minds in deaf education. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our keynote for this afternoon, Dr. Michelle Abbasis. Dr. Abbasis has almost 30 years of experience in education, both in teaching and now as the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Flagler College, just a few miles away. So again, thank you very much for being here today, and we will transition to Dr. Abbasis.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. Thank you for being a part of this webinar. Today, I will talk about reading culture and going beyond the expository book and reading. First, I would like to share a quote, an old quote, but still relevant for today. Take a look at the slide. As we continue, I'd like you to think about yourself as a teacher and how you integrate reading, not only daily in using teaching skills like phonics and fluency, but how to incorporate reading culture beyond. And throughout this presentation, we'll ask you to reflect on a few things. This won't be interactive. For this setting, that would be too difficult. But if we have scratch paper or something, you can jot down your thoughts to help you look back, perhaps after today, and apply some of what you've learned to your daily teaching. First, ask yourself, who is responsible for teaching reading? Who is that person? Who does elementary school? Who's responsible? Is it in middle school or in high school? So think about that for a minute. We already know in elementary school, we tend to focus on reading skills using the Big Five, including phonemic awareness, alphabetic principles, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. This is the foundation for basic reading. We tend to teach this during elementary years. What do we do beyond? What skills are needed? So reflect for a moment. Think about reading. Think about how reading ties into language. Think about how reading is a cognitive process. So while we're thinking about reading as a challenge and what challenges we face, see the research here on this slide. These are things that we already know and we have known. Reading achievement in deaf education. We see deaf or hard of hearing students who graduate high school align only 5% with their hearing peers. We also tend to see at a 4th grade level, reading level. So I will return to that in a moment. We also know deaf and hard of hearing students struggle with content reading and expository reading skills. They also struggle with reading comprehension. That 4.0 plateau. Why are they capping out at that level? This is very important. So we will address why we feel that the 4th grade reading level is so important. How can we push beyond that plateau? That is not a new concept. This idea was talked about in the 80s by researcher Jean Chall. We're acquiring reading, acquiring basic skills in reading, and then arrives to 4th grade, something happens. And there's a struggle to push beyond 4th grade, but not only for deaf children, but for hearing children as well. Something is happening in 4th grade that's important to identify. In 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, as we read, we're learning how to read. We're sounding out words, or decoding, signing aloud stories. We're arriving to 4th grade, and the expectation changes. Instead of learning to read, now we're reading to learn new information. So Chall identifies that there's a difference. So what do we do in between? How do we transition in learning to read towards learning from the text? So that means we need to learn additional skills to allow the student to understand different types of text. So what we already know is when we shift from learning how to read to reading to learn something new, the text is more complex. It's difficult to navigate. Students need specific instruction that's tied perhaps directly to the reading to pass that barrier. The concept really pushes through these concepts, basic literacy, where they're starting to learn how to read, and then we move into the critical literacy, which means where you're really looking to analyze and figure out what's happening. And what we want eventually is dynamic literacy, which is our ultimate goal. This is what we want for most of our students to achieve and understand and get that experience. But critical literacy is important to get to that point. So what is the meaning of complex text? As we're learning to read, we're looking at narrative text. Very predictable structure, predictable order of what happens before and after the next. So as children are learning how to read, it's easy to follow. As text becomes more complex, we start to talk about new information that students must learn. They're learning something new, and usually you will see this in a textbook, article, newsletter, other expository text. You'll see more complex text. Usually the vocabulary and the structure and so forth involved is more complex. It's more difficult. And it's not as predictable. So for example, when we introduce content and complex reading, social studies perhaps, you require more information than understanding how to read. You need the social studies concepts. So you're reading as a historian, or how do you read like a social studies person, someone who knows the background of social studies? ingrains into reading our comprehension. So we know this from research, and this looks different from other content areas. For instance, science reading is not the same as social studies reading. Science reading requires reading like a scientist. Math reading requires reading like a mathematician. And different content areas require different skills for successful comprehension.
What we know is that content area teachers aren't teaching reading in that format. They're not teaching those literacy skills. Content teachers area feel it's my responsibility to teach this content, whereas they might not be as focused on teaching reading specific skills. They might feel they're not as responsible for teaching reading in the elementary, high school, or levels. But my question I'd like to pose to you all is that we're all responsible for teaching literacy at all grade levels, because reading skills are evolving throughout a child's education, and they apply to every content area. So in reading with the content areas, it requires more than just the basic Big Five that we mentioned before. So we're going to dive a little bit further into the Big Five and see how we can overlay those with content area reading skills. Research has led us to understand how content area teachers are not teaching content area reading skills as often as they should be. Content area teachers typically avoid or don't know how to teach those literacy skills. So we have the Big Five. Those are the basics for our foundational reading skills. We're making that shift to require more of those Big Five when they're learning in the content areas. For example, background knowledge, which includes activating a child's background knowledge and also building their background knowledge. Those are both features of background knowledge. There's also text features required. There's text structure. And there's specific content area vocabulary that needs to be taught. It's specific to that content area. And there's also inferencing. And all of these tie into the Big Five and help to support that transition from learning to read to reading to learn new information. So now I'd like to dive into a little bit more of each of these elements. So first, we're going to do a short activity. And this is really to give you an experience and help you understand how background knowledge ties in and how that feels. I'm going to show the next slide for about 5 seconds. And I want you to try to memorize as much of what you see on the slide as you can. Okay? And then we'll stop. And then I'm going to ask you a question after that. Are we ready? Okay, just 5 seconds. Okay, did you get it? Did you memorize it all? How did that feel? Think about that. Were you able to memorize the whole letter sequence? Maybe some of you could, maybe some of you couldn't. And many of you might have been like, oh, I think I had it, but now I forgot. You might feel a little bit fuzzy on some of the letters you saw. So I provided this activity to you without activating any background knowledge or giving you any support. So now I'm going to activate your background knowledge, meaning I'm going to give you a hint. And that hint is TV networks. And now I'm going to show you that same slide again. So maybe you noticed the second time after your background knowledge was activated, where you were more easily able to remember that letter sequence. I activated your background knowledge and I gave you your brain, I set your brain up to receive that information and make a connection with it. So background knowledge is a very strong and important skill. I currently teach pre-service teachers at Flagler College, and I stress the importance of activating background knowledge because when you do that for students, it allows their brain to open up and more easily learn that new information. It helps reduce their cognitive load, and it prepares their brain to access that new information. It also helps with their working memory, and often this skill is referred to as a strong foundational skill for all other reading skills that will come after that. So if you can activate and build that background knowledge, it means you're providing a good foundation for all skills that you'll teach beyond this point. So how do we do that? How do we build background knowledge? You might notice several slides where there's links to new information. Don't worry about that now. I'll provide the links to all of these slides so that you'll have access to that, and you can go back through at a later time and click those slides to access it. And you can always email me directly to receive those too. For background knowledge, this research by Fisher and Fry, there were two researchers that talked about indirect and direct methods of activating knowledge. Some are expensive and time consuming, but they're also very effective. If you have a field trip, if you're doing a lab or an experiment or a demonstration, those are strong direct methods that you can use to access or to activate background knowledge. Field trips, labs sometimes cost money, and I know budgeting could be a concern, but indirect methods can be just as effective, and that can include teacher modeling, and then each student doing an activity related to what was modeled. They could do think aloud, read aloud, depending on your modality. So those are two ways. And if you're able to click that link, it'll expand and give you some more ideas of activities you could do with your students. As we increase the amount of activation and building of background knowledge that we do, and the text becomes more complex, students are able to more easily connect with text. For example, we have the text-to-text connection, where a student might have seen something or been modeled something, and then they might see that in another format or on another platform and make that text-to-text transfer and connection. We also have text-to-world, and those are real-world events, life skills. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. And so you always want to ask yourself, how am I activating and building background knowledge during reading instruction? So think about that for just a moment. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is text features. And this is related to an article by Howell and Luckner. This article will be linked for you at the end of the slide. So if you'd like to take a look at that article, you will have access to it. Sorry about the shift in the text on the screen. So text features are things that you see while reading that help to activate comprehension and knowledge. It could be a map. If you're reading in social studies class about a specific place, you might want to refer to the map to help build concepts and help support that comprehension. Text features are very critical, especially with students who struggle with reading English. If English isn't their first language, text features can really be a bridge and a support system to their understanding. And so I do want to highlight one example. So read this for me, what you see here on the screen. Are you able to read that? Do you understand that text? It's literally Greek. And so you might be looking at that, feeling puzzled and thinking, how am I supposed to read this? So what if I give you this? Did that help? Maybe you notice the pattern. So this is the Greek text of Twinkle, Twinkle, the lyrics to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And so you might notice patterns there. You could see the star. You could use your background knowledge and recognize the patterns and say, oh, I've seen this somewhere before. And then you can make that identification to help you with that comprehension. So this is a very strong element that'll help aid in comprehension. And with Howell and Luckner, their research in the article specifically talked about a 6th grade student who was in a mainstream deaf education environment, going through school, reading in the content areas, and then this student came to 6th grade science and experienced a lot of struggles and was spending hours on their studies and not being able to complete homework and really struggling in this content area. And one strategy that Howell and Luckner identified was looking at text features to help the student navigate the content area text. Looking at titles, headings, captions, all of this being key as a way to help that student navigate through the chapters from beginning to end in the textbook. Taking those text features in chunks and helping to using them to help find information and comprehend the text better. And we can talk about that a little bit later with the ARC, with ARC. So now I want you to think about, how am I using and identifying text features in my instruction? Do you do that? Do you point out the map? Do you point out the graphs? Are you looking at those text features with your students? And I want you to think about ways that you can incorporate teaching specific text structures in your instruction. So the next skill with text structure is an easy strategy to implement and to help students navigate through these structures. And typically, text structures are found in expository text. They can also be in nonfiction text structures, such as descriptions. They can be order and sequence. They could be cause and effect, compare and contrast. There are others, yes, but typically these are the ones that you see that nonfiction text structures have. Narrative text structure is very predictable, and most people are very familiar with it. They've seen it before. If you think about narrative text structures, it typically begins with once upon a time. You know, there was someone walking through a forest, and then something happened, and another happened, and a problem occurred, and then the problem was solved, and then they lived happily ever after. That's a very predictable and typical narrative text structure. When you look at nonfiction text structures, they're more complex. They're less predictable unless you specifically direct students to look for these features and structures. For example, social studies teacher, maybe you're reading about the Civil War and what the causes of the Civil War were and what happened as a result. So if you're reading that chapter with that in mind, before you began, did you let the students know this chapter's structure is going to be descriptive and it's going to have a lot of explanations, so that they can first begin the chapter with that expectation in mind. And then the last part, you can expect to read about this, so forth. So again, you have to reduce that cognitive load for them, make it more predictable for them so that they're aware of what to expect. At the beginning, they're going to look for causes. In the middle, they'll look for some action. And then towards the end, they'll shift to what happened. And then they can more easily shift between those transitions within the chapter. If you're teaching science and you're talking about describing the life cycle or something like that, like the life cycle, for example, if you show how it can be more, is not only linear, but they can follow the pattern of the cycle and then come back to the beginning. They can sort of take in that information on their own and organize it in a way that is more easily comprehensive to them. And this is a huge support for them and a huge feature that will help with their comprehension.
So reflect to yourself how you incorporate text structure in your instruction of content. This next part is my favorite. It might make you mad. Stay with me. Content-specific vocabulary is critical for comprehension of reading text. For content reading, for complex reading, we tend to focus on multiple meaning words. For example, when you are running, when you run for something, or when you run something, there's different concepts for that term run. So many meanings. So we'll focus on those words. Another one is morphographemic analysis. There are several articles that have this topic, and there are links for you to view at the end so you can view more. Morphographemic analysis means breaking down words in different morphemes. For example, tricycle, tri, cycle, wheel. You have the three. You understand there's three wheels. You understand that it's a bike with three wheels. Bicycle, bi meaning two, cycle meaning wheel. You'll understand my bicycle is something you're riding with two wheels. It helps students understand the different parts and meaning within vocabulary words. It's an essential skill. And the final concept being FastMap. Right now, I'm doing a demonstration of what that means. So if you're interested in learning more about FastMap, this image will actually go into a video that will explain to you more about this. The captions are okay, they're not bad, they're not perfect, but you'll be able to see that experience in the classroom and what students are doing. And then you'll practice. Ready? Meet my friend. My friend's name is Snurk. Snurk walks using flaxes. How many flaxes does a snurk have? Should we have said 6? How would you know that if you hadn't heard of flax before? But you used your background knowledge and prior experience. You can read most of these words and comprehend most of these words, but flax? To not know what that means, but you see a picture and you're able to use your background knowledge to figure out that flax means feet or legs. Are you ready for the next one? More complicated. Snurks have twice as many flaxes as amphilinks. Where are the amphilinks? So you've already learned the word flax prior. So now we apply this to our new word, amphilinks. You should have said antennas. Did you? Snurks are covered with garzlem. Garzlem is like what? You should have said fur. Again, using your background knowledge and looking at the text, features, and picture should help you understand even if you've never seen the word before. Like dogs, snarks can wag their pangiers. Where is the pangier? You should have said tail or its bottom. And how would you know that, never having seen the word? Using your background knowledge and context within to understand. Now, this is really difficult. This is tough. You ready? Do you think snarks can bespooch? Why or why not? Can you answer that? Kind of a tough one. For me, I can't answer that because I don't have enough information. My background knowledge is just not enough to answer this. The context is not enough to answer this question. This is like what some of your students feel while reading. They see a word, they read a word, it's not enough information, they don't know what it is, there's not enough background knowledge to use those context clues, it's just impossible to determine. So now, how does this connect to vocabulary instruction? Well, if as a teacher you need to decide how many vocabulary words you're using, typically when you're asking the audience, you say 10 words every week, 20 words every week. I don't recommend it. I know, don't panic. But I actually recommend for vocabulary instruction to narrow it down for elementary, maybe 1 or 2 words a week. That's for vocabulary, specific vocabulary. It doesn't mean you don't actually address and talk about vocabulary, but when I say a vocabulary word for the week, you're delving into teaching vocabulary, which you're still talking on, expanding, addressing, exposing in other ways, but when you're teaching and learning definition, including it into a sentence, and you're doing that activity, do that just for 1 or 2 words for elementary. In middle school, you may go up to 3, for high school, 5. Why? Let's go back to FastMap. Remember the different words you encounter: flaxes, ampholinx, garzlem, pangiers, bespooch. They were easy to figure out, the first few, because you had background knowledge and it was easy to integrate. You had context. They were easy to figure out. You could compare to something else. You had enough information to figure out the meaning of the word. So if you were teaching vocabulary and you had to pick an important one, which would you feel out of this list was most important? For me, I would pick bespooch because the text did not incorporate enough background knowledge or context to comprehend the meaning of that word. So that is the most difficult word. I will still address flax and talk about the word and use it in a sentence, but as far as formal instruction of the word flax, I wouldn't. I would focus more on bespooch. It's critical for understanding the text. There's not enough information or context in the other text to understand that vocabulary word or to figure it out through background knowledge. So, as a teacher teaching a content area, how will you all select vocabulary words for instruction? Is it too much? Not enough? Maybe think about how you would differentiate and select the vocabulary word for instruction. You want the most effective opportunities for instruction. You want critical vocabulary that relates directly to reading and text. And the final skill here is inference. Inference. This is tough because you can't really see it. It's tough because it's not observable. But it is so important Remember when we talked about background knowledge, direct methods and indirect methods. We're starting with text to self. You're thinking about relating the text to yourself. And then, more complicated, is text related to another text, text to text. And then the last, really important for dynamic literacy, where we actually want to achieve, is being able to connect text to world. And that requires inference. So how do we infer, and how do we incorporate inference? First, we need to understand the different groups and categories. For example, text to text. You're inferring through what you see in text. For example, if you see a sentence that says, Susie is happy, she is smiling, who's she? You, as a reader, will look directly at the text to find that answer. She means Susie. How do I know? Well, first, it said Susie is happy. The second sentence says says smile. You think happy and smile are related. And if you know, Susie tends to be a girl's name most of the time. She tends to mean girl. I could probably tie those together. She could be Susie. That would normally be the answer. So you would use your background knowledge, your background experience to make the connection. You wouldn't seek outside of the text to make the connection. So that is the most basic kind of infer. And how would you use that? You look at the text to find the clues within the text. Easy. More complex would be elaborative, also called gap filling, used interchangeably. The bike was gone. Jack saw the broken chain in the grass and began to cry. What do you infer from this? Sometimes we'll get different answers. Most of the students will answer the bike was stolen. Someone stole it. But how did you know? Nowhere in the text did it say stole. You have to connect what you've experienced plus what is in the text. For example, the bike is gone. It's not there anymore. It means there's no bike there, which means there used to be a bike there, but now there's no bike there, so something is missing. Okay. The chain broke. So background knowledge, typically when you leave your bike, you do chain lock it so it's safe. And if it's broken, well, someone might have damaged it. And last, Jack begins to cry. So does that make you think Jack broke it? No, somebody else must have. So you have to use outside information here to figure out and connect the dots. So that is gap filling infer. You need to have some kind of experience or background knowledge to figure out what really happened here. And finally, the most complex is global infer, which means, what do you think the author means while he writes this? What do you think he meant while he wrote this? Maybe you're right and maybe you're not, but you're thinking outside of the text, you're thinking outside of your experience, and you're thinking outside of your perspective. This is complex, but important and required for that dynamic literacy piece. You want to shift to the most complex way of interacting with the text. You must be able to see outside of yourself and your own perspective. Think of others' perspectives. They may be similar and they may be different. The author's perspective may be different than mine. I may believe one thing and someone else may believe another. So you have to negotiate at that point, and it requires a lot more skill. And so how do we do this? We have to incorporate what we call HOT questions. HOT, higher order thinking questions. So if we look at this example, we look at Bloom's taxonomy. And if you take a look, you see different skills that are required in this concept. You want to remember there's understanding, applying the skills. Make it easier so you're not, that doesn't require heavy thinking or analysis or heavy use of background knowledge or, seeing other people's perspectives or different ways of understanding. But as you move up into analyzing, evaluating, and creating, those skills require more outside text to world knowledge. So if we align how we interact with our students during instruction through questioning, we're able to elicit some of those responses related to more world to text engagement.
And so when you think about incorporating higher order questions, it's not always easy. Those lower level questions can be a little easier to incorporate. For example, who is the president? That's an easy question to answer. It doesn't require that you ask why. You don't have to think about anything. You don't have to say, how am I going to ask this question? You just ask the question and you receive the reply, and the answer is either right or wrong. But if you want to move up the continuum and you think about here in St. Augustine, what are the most common trees that grow? Is it a palm? Is it a live oak? Is it a pine? Which trees grow best here? You have to know some outside information about the town of St. Augustine, such as the temperature, the weather patterns, if it freezes here, if it's close to the ocean. You have to know those different environmental things to consider the answer to that question. So it's more complex. It requires you to evaluate and then respond. And you could have a variety of responses. So as you move up the continuum, the questions become more complex, the responses become more complex, and it takes time to consider what's required. It takes planning ahead to ask those types of higher order questions. I want to include one more slide a little bit later that talks about data related to higher order questions. A few years ago, several years ago, I was allowed to be involved in some different classroom observations and of teachers in the content area. And there were both hearing and deaf teachers involved. And the data showed that for questioning skills and strategies and methods, typically lower order questions were taught and asked. And so that was good for comprehension at the comprehension level, talking with students. There were good questions. And we weren't encouraging reducing that, but it was rare to have those higher order thinking questions involved because the answers don't come right away. Those higher order questions have to be planned and prepared for, and that's what the research showed us. So students at Flagler College, when they're writing and documenting and creating lesson plans, they're asked to think about those higher order thinking questions and how they're going to incorporate them. So you've got all of these questions in your lesson plan, that's great, but have you planned for the higher order thinking questions? Have you put that in the back of your mind? Remember to think about including those so that students can get used to answering questions that become a little more complex and require more connection with the text and that are more in line with that dynamic literacy that we're always striving for. We always want to overlay that with what we're doing. And so while we're reading, we want to incorporate, what should I be asking myself about this, such as what the author's purpose might have been, or if I change the scenario or whatever's happening with the text that you're looking at. You have to ask the readers those types of questions so that they can understand the whole picture of what they're reading. And so now I'd like to ask you to reflect and ask yourself, how are you incorporating complex questioning during your instruction? So we've covered a lot today about teaching content area reading skills. And if you click through the slides, there's a little bit more information that you can click on to get more information later. And I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. I don't want you to feel like, it's a lot of information that's been coming at you in a short period of time. And if you're a content area teacher, how are you going to change your practices? I understand all of that. It's not typical for content area teachers to focus on reading, but literacy and reading is an important part of the content areas. So I do want you to ask yourself, what strategies can you focus on? Maybe if it's just one or two strategies you have that were your go-to strategies that you could incorporate during your lesson planning that would help teach reading in the content area. Because really all content area teachers are responsible for teaching reading. You want to keep it short and simple. For example, with vocabulary, you don't want to overwhelm students with lists of words that they've got to memorize and teach and learn. So you can't teach all of the words. That's an impossibility. But you can teach strategies for how to analyze specific words or parts of words or multiple meaning words. And those strategies will support the student's understanding of that text they're reading. And then after they leave your classroom, they'll still have that strategy and they can apply that strategy to figuring out words in other areas. While teaching content areas, there are different ways you can incorporate reading strategies. For example, if you're teaching social studies, and you found an article, even if it's a short article that mentions something, you could put it up on the board or in a PowerPoint slide and read that with the students to support their understanding of reading in the social studies content area. And you don't have to elaborate on that for a long time. It doesn't have to be a big lesson, but just a little bit of short exposure every day goes a long way to building that skill. And with activating and building background knowledge, again, it's important that they have that activated, that framework ready before they start the work of reading. If they get to class and they just start reading and they have no connection to it, it's harder to comprehend. So if you're showing examples and providing support through the reading the text together so that they can acquire those new words and then discussing it with them, and then they go on with their independent reading activity, they're likely to be more successful. And they can make better connections. They'll have different experiences in class that can support their background knowledge and their world knowledge while they're reading. And also, you have to understand how it's complex. If you pass out an independent reading activity or an instructional activity, and they don't have that activated knowledge, those higher order questions, if they're there, are going to be more complex and difficult to answer. And so I think it all really boils down to how much support you provide. So I've included several articles here. The citations don't have direct access, but if you want to know more about it, about the research that was included here, the instructional strategies, you can take a look at these citations. The two articles that I mentioned today, Howell and Luckner, the one about the 6th grade students struggling with their science reading and what we did to help, and the morphographic instruction analysis. Those articles right there are clickable links with direct access to both articles. And here's two websites I thought you might find helpful. You can click on those and see what information is provided there. They have different activities that you can incorporate during reading instruction. And finally, if you want access to these slides with all of the clickable links, you can take a screenshot of the QR code. Or if that's not possible at the moment, you can email me and I'll be happy to provide those resources. I'll be happy to chat with you over video. If you want more discussion about how you can incorporate content area reading instruction. Thank you so much for your time today, and I hope that you learned something new, even if it was just a small takeaway about how you can incorporate content area reading instruction. I hope that you learned something. Hello. Thank you to Dr. Basas for her wonderful and impactful presentation. Today, I want to briefly talk about how we have included some of these strategies with classroom reading instruction and how we inspire and motivate our students to become readers. My name is Callie Trado. I'm from the Florida School. I'm the Florida School for the Deaf. I'm the literacy specialist in the Elementary and Early Learning Center, and soon you'll meet our high school literacy specialist, Brent Bechtold. So let's get started. So we're going to do something called a waterfall chat. Okay, now don't jump ahead. Follow my instructions. I want you to think of a book from your past that inspired you to love reading. What book inspired you to love reading? And I want you to type it in the chat, but I don't want you to press send. So we're just typing. Don't send it. So type the title of the book that inspired you to be a reader and to love reading. Type it in the chat. Do not press send. So hold. Type it in and hold. So go ahead and do that now. But don't send it. Are we ready? 1, 2, 3, send it. Okay. And I can't see the chat from my perspective, so I assume we have a lot of book titles showing up. The point is, we all have a book that inspired us to love reading, or maybe you don't love reading so much. I'm going to let you take a moment to read this slide for yourself. So this means that different instructional strategies are important. We want the students to become readers. We want them to love the act of reading, no matter what level they're reading at. But the big question is, how do we do that? Research has shown that motivation is a big factor, and it must include 3 things. It must include autonomy, belonging, and competency. For motivation to occur, it has to have these 3 elements. And so how do we increase the likelihood that these 3 elements will motivate students to love reading, to help them master reading, help them become fascinated with reading and be a lifelong reader? So I'm going to give you some ideas today, and then I want you to think about some things you can do and incorporate. And I'll show you one thing that you might want to pick and incorporate into your classroom. And you might see some ideas that you don't want to include, but that's great. We're going to share a lot of ideas today, and you can take what applies to you. So this is me with my book cart. And these are some of my cute little students. So if students read a lot, how do we reward them? We actually give them more books. Our reward for reading is more books. And we don't just give it to them nonchalantly. We really encourage them to thoughtfully pick a book. They order books through magazines online, through Scholastic magazine. They can order 2 books We don't reward a lot with toys or special lunches or motivators like that. We really want to inspire them to read with reading more books. So the autonomy comes into play when they are able to pick their own books. You know, some like certain types of books, if they like a book about cats or their favorite topic, they get autonomy from picking the kinds of books that they like. They have a special time to choose which books they want to get, and the students are given those books to keep. They're theirs to take home, to put in their own library. Students get a little bit obsessive with me. If I don't get the book that they want exactly on time, they come to me. They're like the next day, where's my book? Where's my book? And I say, okay, well, I ordered it, but I have students who arrive every day on a daily basis and come to see me inquiring about where their books are going to be. So I've taken pictures of some kids with the book cart here. They really love the book cart when I come by with it. And so how do we talked about the fact that we reward reading with more books. And so we also have our reading log program. Students read for 15 minutes. They sign their one line on the reading log. And if it's 30 minutes, they sign for 2 lines. So they keep track of their reading log. And when they reach 100 lines, which is 125 minutes of reading, they get to request a free book. And that's in the elementary school. The middle school and the high school have a little bit of different systems that apply more to their age levels, but they do also reward reading with reading. And again, like I said, extrinsic motivators such as toys or something we don't use very often. So we really want to encourage that autonomy in letting them choose their books to encourage that love of reading. And it's also vital that we inspire the students in their autonomy in the classroom library. We have to have a variety of books for the child to choose from in the classroom library. We want books there that they can connect with. And that's where the B for belonging comes into play. In the library, they want to have books that they feel connected to. And the C comes into play with competency. And that's providing books at a variety of levels. So if we have a 5th grade student reading at a 1st grade level, they need to be able to find a book that they connect with at that level. If they choose a book that they take a look at and don't understand, then we need to find a book that is more adapted to their level. And you know, the student feels like, I belong here. This is my place. They have their reading boxes with their chosen books in them, and they really enjoy that process of building that box of books for their personal library. With the American Reading Company, we use the color level system, meaning that the teachers confer with students on a regular basis, and they talk about their growth with them. They talk about growth between color levels and amongst color levels. And we have this painted flower wall where we show growth. So during recess time, I'll go out and I'll get the kid and I'll say, come on in here with me. We're going to look at your growth level, and we'll go into the school building where we have this displayed, and they pick a color, and if they'll be creative with the colors and shapes that they pick for their display of their growth. And we all have challenges, and students have to learn how to work around those challenges and figure out how to show their growth. And so here's a picture of what this growth wall looks like. And it's divided into 3 categories, hitting the 50 or 100%, growing a color level, and showing projected growth on an assessment. And we don't want to embarrass the students, so that's why we've got these flowers. You know, if they say like, oh, we know that this flower belongs to this child, it's anonymous, but it's a way that they can recognize their own growth. And we also focus, we don't want to only solely focus on competency, we want to also focus on growth. So for that, we have data notebooks, and that's a way that the student can easily see their data and see what level they're at and take pride in seeing their progression as they grow in their abilities. In the middle school level, we have electronic growth notebooks, and they can sit and confer with their teacher about their growth in that way. And then the high school has a system for conferring with students and talking about growth data also. So at my level, each student knows what their goal is. So autonomy, belonging, and competency is really crucial for teachers to incorporate so that students can continue to show their growth and their love for reading.
Hello, I'm Brent Bechtold. This is my sign name. I'm a high school literacy specialist at Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind. The question is, can time spent reading independently in school translate to academic performance? The answer is yes, it can. It can improve reading fluency, signed, spoken, and/or silent, including rate, automaticity, accuracy, and prosody, which could include facial expression. It can increase reading comprehension, build background knowledge, broaden and expand vocabulary, kindle and foster motivation. Only if a teacher scaffolds through modeling and teaching students to self-select books from a variety of genres at their reading levels, conferring with students, like Callie mentioned earlier, monitoring and providing feedback to students, ensuring that students are accountable for their reading. And I don't mean give them a test right after they read, but to have that conferencing session with a student. There's traditional independent reading, sustained silent reading, or DEAR, drop everything and read, compared with a new idea, a new term, scaffolded silent reading. Here are the differences between SSR and SCSR. These are some important differences. The teacher instructional role, classroom library or book collection design, motivation and engagement, level of text difficulty, teaching, monitoring, and feedback, and student accountability. I want to focus on the SCSR, scaffolding reading, and how you're selecting a book. You're not just, here's a book, now go and read, but you're there with them as a teacher. There are different genres that students can select at different levels of reading. Student choice is circumscribed to encourage wide reading use using a genre selection wheel. Also, students are able to choose, or adults are able to choose text at their independent reading level. There's a color label that they're identified at and can choose books with their color. Teacher initiates brief, maybe 5-minute individual student reading conferences. They can provide support this way. This is information from a book, and their independent reading is not just from no support. And this evidence is from Miller and Moss. So you want to expose your students to a variety of books, topics, genres, and this is one way to do so. I had a former student title me or tag me on Facebook saying, hey, Mr. Bechtold, you should do this. And we did. We've partnered with our D&B Designs program here on campus, which is actually made here on campus. And we have these book covers on our walls. The teachers will select their favorite book that's impacted them in the young adult literacy genre, and they'll put their favorite quote from the book at the top and the book cover on the entire wall. Another important thing to consider is the volume of reading. Daily, research shows that there are specific numbers of minutes to keep in mind. First, to maintain your level of reading, you need to read at least 25 minutes a day. Doesn't mean you're going to grow, but it does mean you won't regress. If you want to increase one grade level in a year, you need to read 45 minutes per day. To increase even further to 2 grade levels in 1 year, you should read at least 90 minutes per day. This research comes from Dr. Allington. Something we need to think about is the end goal. We want our students to love reading. And if we think about the students when they graduate, will they love to read then? No, we need them to learn to love to read here while they're at school before they graduate. That's my goal. If you haven't read the Penny Kittle Book Love book, I highly encourage it. This is from the idea of Allington, every student, every day. Think about what your student is currently reading. And this could be reading in different ways. This could be something that's physical or digital. You can physically put it on student lockers. They can have it on the side of their laptop. They can have it in their classroom on the wall. So here are some examples that students have done, like sticky notes, where you're putting a sticky note with each student's name and changing out to a new book every time they're reading a new book. They can also laminate these Post-it notes and write and be able to change out what they're currently reading by just simply erasing and writing with a dry erase marker. And you can also use Goodreads digitally, Google Classroom. You can also use Flip, formerly known as Flipgrid. They're calling it Flip these days. If your school has Microsoft, that's actually a free program, and it was actually designed with deaf people in mind. You can video yourself, you can take pictures of a book, you can have it next to the student's picture, look at what you're reading now. If you want to expand this, it can become a little bit of a book talk where the students are talking about the book. The student can respond to another student's video by video or by a typed comment. Of course, I always make examples, teachers make examples and share them. Think about this clay. I remember we had the waterfall chat in the beginning of this with Callie asking about what book really impacted you and helped you become a reader and love to read. So think about joining a pottery class, and it's day 1, and you ask the teacher, what kind of pottery is your favorite to make? And the teacher says, well, me, I don't make pottery, I'm just teaching it. I mean, as a student, you think, what? That's impossible. So we as reading teachers need to be readers as well. If you're not a reader yet, fake it till you make it, right? So you will become a reader. So similar, every student every day, we look at every staff every day. And so we have this sign, this is a template we use, that's outside of every office or classroom where every staff, and that's not just reading teachers, but assistant principals, or not just teachers, but your custodial staff, everyone has this outside their room and can share what they're currently reading and what they're reading next and why. And why do we want to talk about what we're reading next? We don't want to have a gap in our reading lives. It's so important that we have a plan for what we're reading now and what we're reading after this. Here's a good way to inspire students to see that every person is a reader, not only those who are ELA teachers. Book stacks. What a good way to really connect with a specific student and their interests. This could be a physical stack, or it can be a virtual list with links. It's very important to have one or the other. The teacher really needs to know their student and their student's interests. So at the beginning of the year or semester, ask your students, send a survey, what kind of reading interests you. Have that book stack on every student's desk. When they enter the classroom, they see what's been selected for them. And that doesn't mean that they're going to love every book in that stack, but as they review, they can say, well, this one I think I'll like, but maybe not this one. And they can decide what they're reading next. And they can make that note on their paper. The one that's digital, that's great. Our school has Sora. And so we can look, see the summary, see what they want to read next. So we also have a book pass. So if there's a new book that's just been added to the classroom library, or a new book from the library, or a book from the ARC box, we show all of these books. There's 8 books, and every student has 1 book. We have a timer, and you start the clock. A student looks at the front cover, reads the back, the summary, opens it up, reads the opening comments, maybe flips a couple of pages, timer runs out, they decide if they want to read that book or not, make that note if they want to read it on their noting plan, on their reading plan and reading log. And after that 1 minute, you're rotating books. After 8 minutes, you reviewed 8 books, and you have a preview that every student has been able to do and read and decide what they want to read.
So with the scaffolded silent reading, they can make those transitions, or it could be at the end of class. You might have a minute or 2 left to do read around. It's not like you have to take time away from your instructional class time. You can do it with all the students in class when you just have a few minutes left. Each student could take just about 30 seconds to go around and talk about what book they're reading now and share a short bit about that. And so the read arounds are a way that you can communicate about books that everyone's reading. It's an easy way to kind of expose students to different genres or different authors that they might not think about. And I think many times teachers recommend books for students and they say, oh, this is really good and you'll really like this. And if a student recommends to student, they're more likely to take that recommendation from a peer. You can also do book talks and book reviews. Book talks are informal. They could just kind of happen on the spot. It's not like a book report. Please don't require a book report of your students. But this is more of just how adult readers can talk about books. You can say, you share what your spouse is reading, or a friend. And you can say, oh, I've read that, or I don't think I like that book. No, I don't want to talk about that. So it's just talking about books with friends, coworkers, peers, and colleagues, family members. That's important also. They can happen at any time in the classroom. A book review could be planned, it could be videoed, but it's important to see the book cover when they do that. The old saying, don't judge a book by its cover, but we all do that, right? We see the cover and it looks great and interesting. We're more drawn to that book. So when you do a book review, make sure that the students can see the cover. And Donalyn Miller wrote a book, The Book Whisperer. And if you haven't read either of these books, Reading in the Wild or The Book Whisperer, I highly recommend them. Book clubs, that's another great way to engage students in reading. It's really fun and it's an active way to get them involved. I took a picture of our book club that we had. This was in our auditorium when we had finished reading a book. We had done a book chat about it. We had a pizza dinner, and then we went to our auditorium and watched the video of the movie with captions, and they really enjoyed that activity. So I'm going to show you a few of the books that we've done for our book clubs in the past. That one was a tough one. I warn you, that's a sad story that got me. So as Callie mentioned, we try to give books as a reward for reading. We reward reading with more reading. And so Allington, you can see here, has a lot of great suggestions for providing books to students. We want to get books in the hands of students. That's key. And most students will continue their growth and increase their reading level throughout the year. They stay on that trajectory. But that won't happen if students don't continuously read. So it's important that they maintain that habit of reading and that they're continuously given books. And when schools close during the summer, I've requested grant money to be able to provide books to students through the summer. They send me the requests for the books that they'd like, and then our high school gives those books. We give a book for every 2 weeks that they're off on summer vacation. So they typically get about 4 or 5 books. And recently we applied that concept to the winter break also, so that they continue reading during that 2-week break when we're off from school. And each student requests their books. We order them from Barnes & Noble. And then we receive those books and we pass them out to the students, and they're typically so excited to receive those books. I know Callie mentioned, you know, the little toys and things. But at the high school level, we sometimes give gift cards as an extra reward. But, you know, students are often chasing me down trying to get their books, and then they send me their book request, and then the next day they're in my office and they're saying, do you have my book? I'm like, well, no, I have to order your book. So, you know, they're really excited about that. And it's important that we see the impact that continuous reading has on the students. They have that intrinsic motivation. If they have those books in their hands, they're going to continue reading and continue on their path of growth. The other way that we can expose children to our love of reading is by this sign that we have on the outsides of our door, 5 books I can't wait to read this summer. And we ask that everyone pick 5 books and then make a small blurb about why they want to read that. And then we can share those around, and we can post it outside our offices or classroom doors, and they can check off what books that they ended up reading. And so these are easily seen everywhere around the school too. Many of us have experienced different levels of engagement in the classroom. You know, sometimes you struggle to get the kids engaged, and you've got to have that carrot there to motivate them. We want them to be intrinsically motivated, but sometimes it's just hard to find that and the way to motivate them intrinsically. And so when they're truly engaged, that's when they are completely involved in the reading for the reading's sake, and they want to, that carrot there, that motivation is intrinsic, and they're truly engaged in what they're doing. This is from Ellen Oliver Keene, and she wrote a book about engaging children and the impact. You see here this chart, it's got the zone of a desired effect. And when we look at this blue zone, that's where we see the most impact. We see more than 1 year's growth within that blue zone. So that's our affected area. And we want to try to continuously have the students shooting for that area. Here are some references if you want to look back at any of the articles or texts that we've referenced here. And I'm always happy to engage with you and answer questions at any time. I'm happy to be contacted through email or even a video conference. Thank you for watching us today, despite missing the eclipse. Hats off to all of you who stayed with us. I'm sad that we missed it, but we were really happy to have you engaged with us. And I'll go ahead and introduce Daphne Werner. She's from the Delaware School for the Deaf, and she was the former principal and now high school literacy specialist, high school language arts teacher. Hi, thank you, Brent. So I'll be presenting and talking about ARC core curriculum. and how we use that here at our school. We have adopted that curriculum and how it ties in with Dr. Basa's presentation, explaining the importance of content area reading and how it can apply to all those areas. And also how with FSDB, how they do such a wonderful job with engaging the students in a positive culture of reading. So the ARC core curriculum is what we're using here at the Delaware School for the Deaf for the K-12 program. ARC core curriculum has been implemented at our school at the K-12 level. And I'm not sure how much background you all have with that curriculum, so I'll just touch briefly on it just so you have a little bit of knowledge about it. ARC core is heavily involved with students in their reading. Just like Brent mentioned about having that support with reading and how that scaffolded reading is so critical, this program incorporates that. It has units that are at each year level, and each unit includes modules for each 9-week period. We have a lit lab, which is an intensive review in reading and how reading applies technology and so forth. There is information, and there's genre study, where we focus on different genres. We go in depth and analyze and read books from many different genres. And then there is a writing portion, which is related to argumentative. All units include writing instruction with those types of reading. So for example, during the argument unit, they'll be learning how to write a strong argumentative essay. They'll be reading different argumentative things and then writing in response to that. So for example, every year, the research lab unit, there's a major element of that is that students have to complete a project, have to do a research project. And so let me back up and explain that the argument and the information is heavy with science and social studies topics in the content area. So again, students are exposed to a lot of different types of text, different text structures, and they're learning how to write different types of text with that structure. And so with the research unit, our students have to become experts, so to speak. They have to do a lot of research on one particular topic or subject. And so while they're experiencing the group instruction, they are then given time for that independent research and opportunities to apply their writing techniques and strategies with the whole class first and then independently. And so again, that relates back to what Dr. Basa mentioned and explained about the key need to have opportunities to access and include that critical literacy and the dynamic literacy at those higher levels. And also, again, it relates to identity for themselves and those higher order thinking questions. Planning for that.
So I just want to give you an example. Our third grade
our third grade class, their unit that they're learning is animal adaptation. And so they are learning some science content. They're learning what is adaptation. How can animals adapt? All students are selecting an animal that they want to research. So they're researching, they're looking through many books, articles, and texts about their animal and how they adapt to their environment. And those students end up writing their own book, publish it, and present that book. Another example, my class, I believe last year for the informational unit, it was tied to energy. And well, I hope all students have background knowledge on the basic concept of energy, but they read, they researched what is energy, how does energy exist, how does it function, and then they can apply to a real world problem. Energy and our world. Should we rely less on electricity? Should we be spending government funds? Should we be researching alternative energy? Different things like that. Those kinds of concepts, students have the opportunity to research and synthesize all of their different learning. And then they can present it in a way that their audience can then read to understand. Okay. So this is great. Since we have started using ARC Core, we have noticed that children are building a very strong foundation of literacy skills, a strong foundation in science and social studies world knowledge, background knowledge related to the content. We know, as we saw in previous presentations, that our students need exposure to world knowledge. They need more continuous exposure to topics, opportunities to learn more about topics. If it's a science class and they're teaching about the human body, yes, the students need more opportunities to have different books to read more about the topic. Sorry, go back. One thing, which is really neat about ARC Core, we are not teaching reading concepts, strategies, writing instruction by itself. It's always within context, the context of the unit, world knowledge and background of what's happening in our world, in their world. I think there was a slide earlier that talked about the importance of relevance. Students need to be able to relate to what they're reading. It doesn't always have to be a fictional story, but even in nonfiction and expository text, there's all information and students are craving to understand their world. Okay, next. Okay, thank you. So with the support and scaffolding, with the theme predicting structure in ARC Core, we at Delaware School for the Deaf have seen amazing growth in our students and their interest and willingness to read and their willingness to write and willingness to film themselves in different projects related to different topics that they've learned. So we talked about literacy as a foundation for all future skills, future opportunities. So I just wanted to share that ARC before, and how we've implemented it here with the goal of just that, having students graduate able to read and enjoying reading and being able to access their world. So, I mean, that really sums it up. That's all for me. It seems like we're wrapped up with enough time to run outside and maybe capture a little bit of the eclipse